The worst financial advice I ever hear is also the one delivered with the most confidence. Work harder, choose better, make more, get rich. As if wealth were still a clean reward for discipline inside a cleanly functioning system, as if the road were open, the race were fair, and the scoreboard accurately reflected effort. I do not believe that anymore. And I think an enormous amount of misery comes from pretending that I should, because once a society makes wealth into the central measure of personal worth, while quietly arranging the economy so that wealth is increasingly inherited, gated, networked, and reproduced through family advantage, it commits a very elegant act of psychological violence. It turns structural exclusion into personal shame. That is the line I want you to keep with you all the way through this story. Structural exclusion gets translated into personal shame. Once you see that, you begin understanding why so many decent, hard-working, intelligent people feel like failures inside a game they were never really allowed to enter on equal terms. They are not only struggling financially, they are being told the struggle is their own fault. That is not a small cruelty. That is the emotional operating system of a rigged society. Now, I need to say something plainly. When young people ask, "How do I get rich?" most of them think they are asking for a strategy, a career, a business, a market, a skill, a trick, a path. But what they often need first is diagnosis, because without diagnosis, every strategy arrives poisoned. Without diagnosis, the person begins by assuming the system is broadly fair and that his position inside it mainly reflects his effort, his clarity, his courage, or his discipline. Then he looks up and sees other people his age buying homes, entering elite professions, traveling, founding companies, managing portfolios, or taking risks he cannot afford to take. And because he cannot see the hidden staircase under their feet, he blames his own legs. That is the first trap. The hidden staircase. The hidden staircase is all the invisible support ordinary people are trained not to count when they compare themselves to visible winners, a gifted deposit. Parents who underwrote the rent in an expensive city, a family network that turned a conversation into an interview, a trust account, a guarantor, an early inheritance, quiet help with school, quiet help with failure, quiet help with time. The world usually sees the finished climb. It does not see the staircase. That matters because once the staircase disappears from the story, the outcome starts looking like proof of merit. The house becomes evidence of maturity. The job becomes evidence of talent. The business becomes evidence of vision. The calm becomes evidence of discipline. The investor looks brilliant. The founder looks brave. The homebuyer looks prudent. The professional looks chosen by the market. Sometimes those things are partly true. But in a society increasingly built around inherited advantage, they are very often incomplete to the point of dishonesty. I have no interest in incomplete stories when they are being used as moral instructions. The first rule is simple. Never compare your visible struggle to someone else's outcome without asking what invisible support stood underneath it. That rule would save people years of unnecessary self-contempt. Because once you ignore the staircase, the world begins lying to you about effort. It says if you just tried harder, learned more, made sharper decisions, stayed more positive, took more risk, woke up earlier, worked longer, and played smarter, you too would be standing where the winners stand. That is very convenient for the people already holding the staircase. It allows the system to keep harvesting admiration for outcomes it largely prearranged, and it keeps the excluded people fighting themselves instead of studying the design. I think that is one of the deepest functions of modern wealth culture. It does not just celebrate riches, it launders structure. Now let me speak about the specific root in the source text because it reveals the larger point very clearly. The speaker says, with unusual honesty, that he made his money through trading, that he was very good at it, and that even with talent grades and major mathematical strength, the door was extraordinarily narrow. More than that, he says outright what almost nobody in elite labor markets likes to admit now, that for people from ordinary or poor backgrounds, a route like that is increasingly almost impossible. Fay Felicite Fay turned 48 file 0 Fay. I respect that honesty because it violates one of the modern professional class's favorite myths. The myth that elite jobs remain open enough that the poor can climb into them if they are simply exceptional enough. I do not deny the existence of exceptions. I deny their usefulness as social explanation. An exception does not prove openness. It proves that total closure is politically inconvenient. A system can remain profoundly biased while still allowing a few remarkable outsiders through. In fact, that is often the smartest way for it to remain legitimate. I call this the exception shield. The exception shield is the way a few visible mobility stories are used to defend institutions that overwhelmingly reproduce advantage for the already advantaged. It is one of the most effective ideological tricks in the whole economy. One scholarship kid gets into the elite university. One poor mathematician gets onto the trading floor. One immigrant founder sells a company. One working class child becomes a minister, banker, judge, or executive. Wonderful. Now, the system points at them and says, "See, anyone can do it." That is not proof of fairness. That is proof of narrative management. Because what matters is not whether 1 or 2 or 100 people escape. What matters is what happens to the median, equally serious person without the same staircase. That is the real test. And on that test, our societies are failing badly. Now let me turn to something even more dangerous. The fantasy of speculative escape. This is where the source becomes, in my view, morally strongest. The speaker says he has tried in limited ways to help friends with trading ideas and discovered what many professionals already know, that ordinary people are extremely vulnerable when they approach markets looking not for disciplined edge, but for liberation. They come to the market not as allocators, but as trapped people hoping for a breach in the wall that makes them reckless very fast. They delay entry, they chase, they add on emotion, they expand from one asset to every asset. They mistake one partial success for a revelation about their own genius. They stop asking whether they are following a system and start acting like the screen is finally validating their self-worth. Then the market takes the money back and usually a little more. Fay Felicite Fay turned 48 file 0 Fay. That is not only a trading problem, it is a social problem. If you close down ordinary paths to wealth, people will reach for extraordinary ones. If a stable job no longer buys a stable life, if housing no longer yields to savings, if the professions feel guarded, if wages cannot outrun rents, if the inheritance staircase grows steeper each year, then the desperate mind starts looking for trapdoors, crypto, FX leverage, day trading, fast money, masculine volatility, high-stakes certainty. These are not only financial products or practices. They are emotional propositions. They whisper, "You have been locked out. But here is your side entrance." That is why I never mock the young men who fall into these systems. I worry about them because they are being sold an illusion precisely at the moment their society made ordinary security harder to reach. I call this the escape hatch trap. The escape hatch trap is what happens when people excluded from stable wealth. Building paths become vulnerable to high-risk speculative schemes because those schemes appear to offer a meritocratic shortcut out of structural defeat. That trap is much larger now than most comfortable people want to admit. And it is not just because the young are foolish, it is because the official ladders have become less believable that matters. A healthy society does not create masses of people hungry for speculative rescue. A sick one does. The second rule is this: when normal routes to security get blocked, dangerous fantasies become more persuasive. That should change how you read almost every online money culture aimed at frustrated young people. It is not simply greed being marketed, it is alienation being monetized. Now, let us speak about another uglier truth in the source text: the distinction between micromobility and macro-immobility. This is one of the clearest and most important ideas in the whole file. Even if people miss it on first read, the speaker says, in effect, that poor people can still often move relative to other poor people. They can get a somewhat better job, a somewhat better salary, a slightly more stable life. They can outwork the people closest to them, but they increasingly cannot leap into the world of the already wealthy. because that world is defended by inherited capital, housing, family transfers, and the whole structure of social reproduction. Felicite Turn 48 File 0 Fe. That is exactly right. And it explains why the system is so psychologically devastating, because it contains just enough movement to keep people running. There is still competition at the lower and middle tiers. You still have to work hard. You still have to try. You still have to study. You still have to protect yourself from falling. You still may become a little more secure than the people next to you. So the society can keep telling the story of effort and reward, but the macro ceiling remains where it is. The truly asset-owning class moves on different weather. That combination is deadly because it means the poor and the lower middle class are not imagining competition. They are really in competition, just not in the competition they think they are in. They are competing intensely inside a narrow band, while the richest strata increasingly float beyond ordinary labor competition altogether. I call this the treadmill band. The treadmill band is the part of the social order where people still experience real pressure to outperform one another, but where that competition no longer opens a credible route into the wealth tier that dominates assets, housing, and political influence. This is why so many hardworking people feel both driven and trapped at the same time. They are not crazy. The contradiction is real. They must work harder than ever just to avoid falling. And even if they win inside their band, they still may not get anywhere near the world their culture told them they should aspire to. That is a terrible design for human dignity, because it creates maximum exhaustion with minimum social clarity. Now, let us speak plainly about shame. The system's greatest trick is not that it extracts money. It is that it convinces people to internalize the extraction as moral failure. If someone inherits the deposit and buys a house at 28, and another person with the same salary but no family money cannot, the second person is taught to ask, "What is wrong with me?" If a closed profession still selects overwhelmingly from wealthy backgrounds, the excluded are taught to ask, "Did I simply not try hard enough?" If a young man gets wiped out in speculative markets after being sold the dream of rapid escape, he is taught to think, "I am weak," rather than, "I was made vulnerable by a system that narrowed my stable options and then marketed risk to me." That is the shame transfer. The shame transfer is how structural barriers get translated into personal inadequacy. It matters so much because shame is politically disabling. Ashamed people isolate. Ashamed people compare. Ashamed people hide. Ashamed people do not unite well. Ashamed people are easier to govern than dignified people. That is why I think the source text's most important line is not really about wealth at all. It is about dignity. No matter how much they take from you economically, they do not get the right to define your worth. Felicite Turn 48 File 0 Fe. That is not motivational fluff. That is strategic. Dignity breaks the shame transfer. Once you stop reading your economic struggle as proof of low value, you become available for a different kind of thought. You can compare structures instead of personalities. You can stop envying the visible winners long enough to study the staircase. You can stop attacking yourself long enough to ask why the race was organized this way. You can stop playing therapist to the system and start becoming its analyst. That is where politics begins. I call this the dignity floor. The dignity floor is the refusal to let a structurally rigged wealth system dictate personal worth, which then creates the emotional stability necessary for solidarity and collective action. Without the dignity floor, people fall inward with it. They can start looking outward. That shift is everything, because a society like this does not get repaired by more isolated striving. It gets repaired by rule change. And that is where the source ends correctly. There are only two serious ways to get rich in a system like this: be born rich or change the rules. Felicite Turn 48 File 0 Fe. Some people hear that and get theatrical, they say, so nobody can ever rise. That is not what it means. It means the honest answer for the majority cannot be reduced to private hustle anymore. It means the center of gravity has shifted. Yes, individuals can still get lucky. Yes, some can still become rich. Yes, rare outliers will always exist. That is not the point. The point is that a society becomes morally obscene when it keeps offering those outliers as the main explanation for everyone else. That is a way of protecting the rule book while pretending to celebrate aspiration. I have no use for that. If housing access, tax law, inheritance structures, education filtering, labor bargaining power, and asset concentration are the real engines of wealth reproduction now, then changing those things is not envy. It is system maintenance. That means higher taxation of concentrated wealth. That means lowering the tax burden where ordinary life gets squeezed. That means restoring roots into housing and security for people without family capital. That means building public systems strong enough that a normal family can once again convert work into stability. That means weakening the inheritance escalator where possible. That means refusing a world in which the rich collectively defend their privileges while everyone else is lectured to compete alone. This is the third rule. If wealth is being protected collectively at the top, it can only be challenged collectively below. That sentence may be the whole political lesson of the age, because the rich understand something the rest of society is still being trained not to understand. Class power works in groups. Tax design is group power. Housing capture is group power. Lobbying is group power. Media influence is group power. Educational closure is group power. Inheritance law is group power. Even markets are group power when you have enough capital and coordination. Meanwhile, ordinary people are told to think only in individual terms. My career, my side hustle, my bank balance, myself, improvement, my grind, my savings, my failure. That atomization is not accidental. It is governance. I call it the solidarity asymmetry. The solidarity asymmetry is the condition in which the wealthy coordinate through policy institutions an inherited advantage while everyone below is trained to interpret declining economic life as a private problem requiring a private solution. Once you see that, you understand why so many people are exhausted. They are not just working, they are trying to solve collective theft with individual effort. That is impossible. No wonder the results look like despair. Now, I want to be careful here. Recognizing the rigged game does not mean giving up on yourself. I despise that interpretation. It means correcting your diagnosis. You still learn, you still work, you still build whatever local security you can. You still protect your mind from predatory illusions. You still avoid debt traps and fake escapes. You still become harder to exploit where possible. You still care for the people around you. You still act. But you stop confusing private coping with systemic justice. And you stop allowing the system to narrate your struggle back to you as proof that you personally are broken. That is a huge difference. The fourth rule is this: keep your agency, but stop using it to defend the story that harmed you. That is maturity. Now let me pull the whole architecture together. There are 4 layers in the file you gave me: the staircase, the trap door, the shame, the redesign. The staircase is inherited wealth, elite access, and invisible support. The trap door is speculative fantasy sold to the excluded. The shame is the conversion of structural disadvantage into private self-blame. And the redesign is collective political effort to change the rules of the game. If you understand those 4 layers, the modern wealth story becomes easier to read. A young person asks, "How do I get rich?" The dishonest answer says, "Choose better, hustle harder, and do not complain." The honest answer says, "The easiest path is inherited." The escape fantasies are dangerous. Your struggle is not proof of low worth. And any serious broad answer now has to include changing the rules. That answer may not feel as glamorous. It is far more useful, and it leads to the only identity shift that matters. Most people are being trained to think like competitors. I want you to think like a rule changer. A competitor asks how to beat the person next to him. A rule changer asks why the race was organized to produce this outcome. A competitor obsesses over what rich people have. A rule changer studies how they kept getting it. A competitor feels isolated. A rule changer starts recognizing allies. That is the more adult position. Not because private life does not matter, because private life cannot carry this alone. And if I were going to leave you with one final sentence, it would be this: there is another part of this that almost nobody teaches properly. Inheritance does not only transfer money, it transfers timing, and timing is one of the most valuable assets in the world. The child with wealthy parents gets to enter adulthood earlier in the only way that matters economically. He can make mistakes earlier and survive them. He can move cities earlier. He can take internships that do not pay enough. He can stay in graduate school longer. He can wait for the better job instead of grabbing the urgent one. He can buy a property before prices move again. He can let investments compound from a larger starting base. He can recover from a failed business because failure did not mean total collapse. All of that looks like confidence from outside. A great deal of it is subsidized timing. The poor are not only denied money, they are denied timing. They are forced to make decisions under pressure that the wealthy get to make under option. That difference is enormous. Pressure produces one class of decision. Option produces another. A pressured person picks the job that pays. Now an option person picks the role that compounds later. A pressured person cannot endure low pay in a prestige field. A pressured person cannot sit through a housing search for years while saving quietly. An option person can buy as soon as the family transfer lands. This is why I think so much advice about patience is grotesque when delivered to people with no buffer. Patience is not a moral trait floating in the air. Patience is often financed. The people preaching long-term thinking usually forget to mention how much short-term pain had already been prepaid for them. That is what I mean by rigged. Not that the poor never move, but that the rich begin with time on their side and the poor begin with time charging interest against them. And once you see that, another part of the modern story becomes easier to understand. Why the poor still fight so hard even inside of because micromobility still matters in lived experience, a slightly better job still matters, a little more rent security still matters, avoiding debt still matters, building a small emergency fund still matters, a local win is still a win. The problem is not that those efforts are worthless. The problem is that the culture lies about what scale of victory they can reliably buy. It presents micro wins as though they remain evidence that the macro structure is fair. They are not. They are evidence that people are resilient inside unfair structures, that resilience deserves respect, but respect should not be confused with consent. You can admire the people surviving the treadmill ban without pretending the treadmill is justice. Do not let a rigged system rob you twice, first in money, then in dignity. Keep the second one. It is the thing that lets you join others and change the first.